The year is 1864. The American Civil War, a maelstrom of blood and iron, was tearing itself apart in its final brutal months. Across the scorched earth of the Confederacy, Union forces were pushing relentlessly, their advance marked by the smoke of burning fields and the cries of a nation in agony. It was a time of immense suffering, of unthinkable acts, and of secrets buried so deep they were meant to be forgotten by God and man. But some secrets refused to stay buried. In March of that year, a detachment of the 34th Massachusetts Infantry found themselves deep in Burke County, Georgia. Their mission: to forage for supplies, to sever Confederate lifelines, and to hasten the inevitable end of this horrific conflict. These were not green recruits. These were hardened men, veterans of battles that had stained the land crimson. They had witnessed the depravity of war, the raw savagery of man against man. Yet, what they were about to uncover on a secluded, decaying plantation, 7 miles outside the small town of Waynesboro, would sicken even their iron constitutions. The plantation was called Thornhill Estate. It wasn't marked on many maps, a forgotten sentinel shrouded by ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss. As Sergeant Silas Thorne led his 6-man patrol towards the crumbling main house, a low, rhythmic thudding reached them. It was a sound that didn't belong, not the wind, not a distant gunshot, but something eerily internal, emanating from beneath the earth. They traced the sound to an old stone structure, a kitchen building, or perhaps a smokehouse, built over a deep, dark cellar. Its only entrance was an imposing sheet of rusted iron, sealed by a padlock the size of a man's fist, ancient and corroded. Thorne, a man whose face was already etched with the weariness of endless campaigns, pressed his ear against the cold metal. He heard it then. The faint, muffled murmur of children's voices, hushed and trembling, like fragile birds trapped in a cage. There was no hesitation. With a brutal swing of a rifle butt, the padlock shattered, its heavy clang echoing in the stillness. The iron door groaned open on rusted hinges, revealing a gaping maw of darkness. As it swung inward, a wave of cold, stagnant air, thick with the cloying scent of damp earth, and something far more disturbing, rushed out, stealing their breath. One by one, the soldiers raised their sputtering lanterns. In the flickering, jaundiced light, the horror revealed itself. 23 children, huddled together in the suffocating darkness, their small bodies entwined, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and an unnerving, vacant calm. The light played tricks, revealing their faces. And that's when the true chill set in. They were a mosaic of hues, some with skin the color of rich earth, others pale as moonlight. But every single child shared the same striking, unforgettable features: unnaturally high cheekbones, eyes of a startling, almost luminous pale green, and hair streaked with threads of auburn and gold. It was a pattern, a horrifying design. The youngest, a boy who couldn't have been more than 4, clung to the tattered dress of an older girl. She, no more than 13, was the first to speak when Sergeant Thorne finally found his voice, his own hands shaking. Her words, whispered from the abyss, were more chilling than any ghost story, more horrifying than any battlefield scream. Mistress says, "We are her legacy. We cannot leave. We are her blood." That night, the 34th Massachusetts Infantry would record the incident in a confidential letter, buried deep in regimental archives for over a century. Local histories of Burke County would later omit Thornhill Estate entirely, as if the plantation and its mistress had simply ceased to exist. An inconvenient truth too ugly to remember. But they did exist. And the woman who created this nightmare, who called herself the Devil Mistress, vanished without a trace into the chaos of a dying Confederacy. Her story is one of the darkest, most disturbing chapters in American history. A systematic breeding program, built not on necessity, but on depravity. Before we continue with the story of Catherine Thornhill, and the disappearance that still haunts Burke County, I need you to do something. If you're hearing this story and it's making your skin crawl, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel dives deep into the darkest corners of American history. The stories they don't teach in schools, the secrets buried in courthouse basements, and forgotten military records. And I want to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment telling me what state or city you're in. Are you close to Burke County, Georgia? Does your town have secrets like this buried in its past? Let's find out together. Now, let's go back to where it all began. To a cold February morning in 1847, when a young widow, facing ruin, conceived a plan so monstrous it would haunt a nation for generations. To understand the horror Catherine Thornhill created, you must first understand the world that created her. Her father, Theodore Danforth, was old Georgia money. His family arrived in the 1730s, building a fortune on rice and indigo before the cotton boom. Catherine had been raised to be a lady of means, educated by tutors, fluent in French, a woman prepared to manage a substantial household. Her marriage to Jonathan Thornhill, 9 years her senior, was not one of love, but of strategic necessity, a merger between two prominent families. She was meant to be the master administrator of an already flourishing property. But the Thornhill she inherited in February of 1847 was anything but flourishing. The estate, a grand old house with 6 columns across its front portico, was a shell of its former self. The paint was peeling, the roof leaked, and the fields, once a sea of prosperous cotton, were now exhausted, their red clay soil choked with weeds. Jonathan Thornhill hadn't been a businessman. He had been a gambler and a drunkard. By the time a winter fever claimed him, the estate was mortgaged to the hilt, and creditors were circling like buzzards. The truth of their situation was laid bare for Catherine by the estate's lawyer, Ambrose Talbot. A thin, worried man, Talbot met her in the house's study, the air thick with the smell of old paper and dust. "Mrs. Thornhill," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "the debts are significant. I've done what I can to delay them, but the bank in Augusta is losing its patience. Without a new source of income, we have 2 options. You can sell the property and the remaining workers, settle the debts, and perhaps have enough left over to live modestly in your father's home. Or you can try to make the plantation profitable again." Talbot didn't hide his lack of faith in the second option. The cotton market was in a state of faux lux, and the fields were depleted. The enslaved workers, once numbering over 40, had been sold off to satisfy Jonathan's debts, their numbers dwindling to just 31. It was not enough to work the fields profitably, not by a long shot. The plantation was a carcass, and Catherine was its sole heir. To return to her father's house in Augusta, to live as a dependent spinster under the roof she had left as a bride, was an act of surrender. It would be a public admission of failure, a stain on her family's proud name. Catherine Thornhill would not, under any circumstances, admit failure. She dismissed the lawyer. She spent the next several days alone in the study, a single candle burning late into the night. She pored over the estate's account books, her mind a cold, churning machine of facts and figures. The land was worn out. The equipment was old. There was no money to purchase more workers. The traditional avenues of survival were all dead ends. It was during one of these sleepless, desperate nights that a new idea took root, an idea that defied every social norm, every human decency, an idea that was not about restoring what was lost, but about building something entirely new, something based on a different kind of commerce, a different kind of property. If she couldn't afford to purchase workers, she would create them. But not in the haphazard, unreliable way of nature. She would not wait 15 years for a child to grow into a productive laborer. No. Her plan was systematic. It was controlled. It was monstrously, beautifully, and terrifyingly elegant. She would create a population of workers who were biologically tied to the estate, who could never be sold because they were her own descendants, who would have an instinctive loyalty to the plantation because it was literally in their blood. The plan, as it came to Catherine in the dark, cold hours of the morning, was a marvel of cold, brutal logic. Her body, she reasoned, was her most valuable asset. She was still young, barely 28, and a woman of exceptional health. If she couldn't afford to purchase workers, she would breed them herself. She knew the idea was an abomination to society, but society had abandoned her to ruin. She had no sympathy for its conventions. What she did have was an instinct for survival and a mind built for meticulous administration. She began keeping a new journal, a leather-bound volume she kept locked away in a drawer of her writing desk. This was no diary of feelings, no outpouring of grief. It was her cultivation records, written in a simple substitution cipher she had used in her girlhood. The pages were filled with calculations, diagrams, and chillingly detached observations. The men she would select were labeled rootstock. The children they would produce became seedlings. Pregnancies were simply plantings. The language was not designed to conceal her actions from a reader. It was designed to conceal the humanity of her subjects from her own mind. Catherine's first selection was a man named Isaac. He was 24 years old, born on the Thornhill plantation, known for his prodigious physical strength and a steady, stoic temperament. To Catherine, he was not a man. He was a perfect specimen of rootstock one. She summoned him to the main house on a March evening in 1847. The air was cool and still. The other enslaved workers had retired to the quarters, and the overseer was out in town. What happened that night was recorded in Catherine's journal with the same emotional detachment she would use to track the rain. First planting completed with rootstock 1, weather clear and mild. She summoned him again 3 weeks later, and then twice more before the month ended. By April, Catherine was confident. She recorded her condition with a final chilling note. Initial cultivation successful. Anticipate harvest in December. To the outside world, she maintained a convincing facade. She spoke to her lawyer about a new business plan, a radical shift in her methods, a bold vision for the future of the estate. The lawyer, Ambrose Talbot, was skeptical, but relieved to see the widow taking action. For the first time, Catherine seemed truly alive. But Richard, her sullen 16-year-old stepson, was watching. He had always held a quiet resentment for his stepmother, a feeling that had festered since she replaced his own mother years ago. Now, he began to notice small, strange things. She had stopped taking her morning rides, claiming the heat bothered her, even though the Georgia summer had barely begun. She dismissed her house servant, an old woman who had attended to his real mother. She took her meals in her room more frequently. Richard knew she was a woman obsessed with appearances. This sudden withdrawal from the public eye was not grief. It was a calculated retreat. His suspicions were confirmed in early June, when he overheard a hushed conversation between Catherine and the local midwife, Mrs. Grayson. Richard was in the library, hidden behind a tall bookshelf, when the two women spoke in the adjacent parlor. "And Mr. Thornhill passed in February, you said?" the midwife asked, her voice clipped and professional. "My late husband and I were intimate in January," Catherine replied, her voice as smooth as glass. "Shortly before his final illness." There was a long, terrible silence. "Of course," the midwife said, her tone carrying a note of something not quite disbelief, but a careful neutrality. Richard pressed himself against the bookcase, hardly daring to breathe. The mathematics didn't work. He had sat with his father every night in January. Jonathan Thornhill had been bedridden, barely conscious, racked with fever. He had been a dying man. There was no possibility of an intimate encounter, which meant the child Catherine was carrying had been conceived after Jonathan's death. Richard's hands began to tremble. The truth was far worse than an affair. It was a cold-blooded, calculating lie, meant to claim the child as a legitimate heir. What kind of woman was capable of such deception? He would soon find out. From that day in the parlor, a new private war began on the Thornhill estate. Richard, a sullen boy, became a quiet observer. He watched his stepmother with a hawk's eye, looking for evidence of the conspiracy he knew was unfolding. He saw her summon Isaac, the man he knew to be the father of her child, to the main house after the other workers had retired for the night. He saw her demeanor around Isaac, not kind, not familiar, but something far more chilling. She spoke to him in full sentences. She looked at him with a dispassionate clinical appraisal, as if he were a prized stallion or a fine hunting dog. To Richard, a boy too sentimental for the harsh world of the antebellum South, it was a violation of every social and moral boundary. He knew this was not a fleeting affair. This was something far more deliberate, far more dangerous. He considered going to the estate's overseer, a gruff, honest man named Frank Abernathy. But Abernathy was a man of simple certainties. He believed in order and the God-given hierarchy of the world. What Richard was about to accuse Catherine of would sound like a fever dream. A respectable widow from a prominent family, using a slave to conceive a child and pass it off as her late husband's. Abernathy would have dismissed him as a fanciful boy, too emotional and resentful of his stepmother. He would have told Catherine, and Richard's quiet surveillance would have been over before it began. So he continued to watch. He saw how the enslaved community kept their distance from Catherine's house, a silent tension that hung over the property. He tried to speak to an elderly house servant, a woman who had been with his family for decades. He asked her questions, carefully, about Catherine's comings and goings, about Jonathan's last days. The woman's eyes went wide with fear. She would say nothing. The fear of the mistress was a palpable, living thing on the Thornhill plantation. Richard was alone. In early August, Catherine announced she would be traveling to Waynesboro to meet with the lawyer and the bank's representative. She would be gone all day. For Richard, this was his one chance. He waited until she was gone, the carriage a small dot on the horizon. His hands trembling, he went to her study. He had to know. He had to have proof. He had to understand what she was truly planning. He went to her writing desk, a beautiful piece of mahogany with intricate carvings. He knew the drawer where she kept her private papers. The lock was a simple tumbler. Richard, a bookish boy who spent his time in the library, had read about such locks. It took him only a few minutes, with a small silver paper knife and a hairpin, to spring it open. Inside, he found ledgers, old letters, and beneath them all, a single leather-bound journal. He knew what it was instantly. He had to crack the cipher. He took the journal to his room, locking his door behind him. For 3 days, he worked in secret, hunched over the book, a dictionary and a piece of paper by his side. It was a simple substitution cipher. After hours of agonizing concentration, he had the key. P was S. A was C. It fell into place with a horrifying, sickening logic. What he read made his blood run cold. It wasn't a romance, a fleeting affair born of grief and loneliness. It was an inventory. It was a plan. The journal laid it out in excruciating, chilling detail. Catherine's play, and to conceive multiple children with selected enslaved men. To raise them as a new kind of property. To breed them with each other. To create a self-sustaining, ever-expanding population of workers who would be genetically tied to her, and to the estate, forever. The pages held diagrams, charts, and cold calculations of expected births over 5, 10, even 20-year periods. He read her observations on the men she selected. Rootstock 1, Isaac. Strong, calm temperament, excellent stamina, desirable. He read her chillingly detached notes on the children she already planned. Seedling 1 will be of high quality. Anticipate pairing with an additional rootstock in 8 to 10 years for first of a new line. It was a document of pure depravity, a human farm ledger. It was a horror so profound, it defied imagination. Richard copied several pages, his hand shaking so violently he could barely hold the pen. This was it. This was the proof. He would take this to the authorities, to the bank, to his grandfather. He would expose her. But that night, at dinner, Catherine looked at him with those cold green eyes, and a slow, humorless smile spread across her face. "Richard," she said, her voice soft as silk, "have you been in my study recently? Some of my papers seem to have been disturbed." Richard's blood ran cold. He froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "No, ma'am," he lied, his throat tight. "I keep certain documents locked away for good reason, darling," Catherine continued, cutting her meat with precise surgical strokes. "If I ever found that someone had violated my privacy, broken my trust in such a fundamental way, I'm afraid I would have to take serious action. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good," she purred. "Because family loyalty is everything, Richard. Everything. Without it, we're simply animals tearing at each other. I know you loved your father very much. I would hate for his memory to be tarnished by scandal, especially scandal that might emerge from within his own household." The threat was clear. She knew. She didn't have proof, but she knew. And she was warning him. If he exposed her, she would find a way to make it look like his vengeful, hateful lie. Who would people believe? A respected plantation mistress from a prominent family, or an awkward teenage boy with a known resentment toward his stepmother? Richard returned to his room that night and, in a fit of despair, burned the pages he had copied, watching his evidence turn to ash. But he couldn't unsee what he had read. He couldn't unknow the monster that lived in the house, and he had a terrible feeling that she wasn't done with him yet. Richard burned the pages of the journal, but the truth remained seared into his mind. He couldn't unknow the monster that lived in the house. He tried to continue his life, to pretend that everything was normal, but he found he couldn't. He kept watching Catherine, and he began to feel increasingly unwell. It started with a persistent fatigue. By September, he found himself exhausted by mid-afternoon, unable to focus on his books. His appetite diminished, and he developed frequent, throbbing headaches that made it difficult to think clearly. By October, he was experiencing muscle weakness and agonizing stomach pains. He was wasting away with tragic speed. Catherine, in a performance of concerned maternal care, showed great sympathy. She insisted Richard stay in bed and prepared his meals herself, bringing him bowls of soup and plates of soft foods. She summoned Mrs. Grayson, the midwife, who also served as a general practitioner. The sharp-featured woman examined him and diagnosed nervous exhaustion, complicated by possible consumption. She prescribed rest, fresh air when he felt strong enough, and a special tonic that Catherine obtained from a pharmacy in Augusta. "Tuberculosis often strikes young men of a sensitive disposition," Catherine told him, her voice a soft, velvet lie as she adjusted his pillows. "Your father had a cousin who died of it at just your age. It is a tragic disease, but we must be very vigilant. I will care for you." Richard knew better. In his hours in the library, he had read about arsenic poisoning. He recognized the symptoms in himself, the gradual wasting away, the digestive troubles, the muscle weakness disguised as fatigue. Catherine wasn't nursing him back to health. She was slowly, methodically killing him. She was disguising murder as disease, eliminating the one person who knew her secret and posed a threat to her monstrous plans. He was too weak to fight back, too isolated to get help. The house servants followed Catherine's orders absolutely. His room was on the second floor, and by November, he barely had the strength to get out of bed, let alone escape the property and reach Waynesboro. He was a prisoner in his own home. He was a dying boy, trapped in a house with a smiling killer. He made one final desperate attempt, a last act of defiance, a desperate plea to save not only himself, but the innocent souls his stepmother was bringing into this world. He spent 3 days in late November writing a letter to his grandfather, Theodore Danforth, in Augusta. He worked for a few minutes at a time, before exhaustion and pain overwhelmed him. He described Catherine's breeding program, her journal, and the poisoning. It was a letter a dying boy wrote, filled with frantic, fevered language, a final testimony. He sealed the letter and gave it to one of the younger house servants, a girl named Pearl, begging her to post it in Waynesboro without telling Catherine. He gave her the last of his pocket money, his voice a hoarse whisper. Pearl, a young girl living in constant terror of her mistress, took the letter. She looked at the boy, pale and wasted in his bed, and then she looked at the letter in her hand. Her fear of the mistress was greater than her pity for the dying boy. She took the letter directly to Catherine. Catherine read the letter, her face expressionless. Then, she walked to Richard's room, a lit candle in her hand. She stood before him, her eyes, those same green eyes from the journal, cold as a winter pond. She did not raise her voice. She did not yell. She simply held the letter in the candle's flame. The paper curled, the ink turned black, and his last hope of escape turned to ash before his eyes. "You're very ill, darling," she said softly, her voice almost tender. "The fever is affecting your mind. You're imagining things that aren't real." She smiled. "It's a mercy, really, that you won't have to suffer much longer." Richard Thornhill died on December 3, 1847, just 3 weeks before his 17th birthday. Dr. Samuel Pritchard from Waynesboro, summoned to record the death, noted consumption as the cause, and remarked that the young man had wasted away with a tragic speed. Catherine wept decorously at the funeral. She wore black for a full year. 4 days after Richard's burial, she gave birth to a healthy son. She named him Jonathan, after her late husband, and claimed he had been born slightly premature, which explained any questions about the timing. Few people in Burke County thought to count backwards from the birth to Catherine's widowhood. Those who did kept their speculations to themselves. It was not the kind of thing one discussed openly. The years that followed Richard's death transformed Thornhill Estate. To the outside world, it was a story of miraculous recovery. While neighboring plantations struggled with falling cotton prices and the depletion of their fields, Thornhill seemed to grow stronger, more prosperous. Local plantation owners, men who had once mocked Jonathan Thornhill's incompetence, now came to Catherine for advice. They marveled at her newfound efficiency, her uncanny ability to make worn-out land produce. They couldn't explain it, but they were content to simply admire the results. But what they couldn't see, what was buried beneath the veneer of prosperity, was the horrifying reality of Catherine's plan. Her cultivation records were not just theory, they were becoming flesh and blood. After the birth of her son Jonathan, she conceived again in 1849, giving birth to a second son, Robert, and in 1851, a third son, William. Each child, a product of her methodical breeding program, was born with those same distinctive features. Catherine's own pale green eyes, her high cheekbones, her auburn hair streaked with gold. She did not attempt to hide their parentage from them. In fact, she did the opposite. This was the core of her monstrous design. The children were raised in a world of psychological manipulation. They were told they were her blood, that they were special, chosen, a new line of Thornhills. They were given slightly better food, slightly cleaner clothes. They were taught to read and write, not to free their minds, but to make them better administrators of Catherine's estate. She treated them not with warmth, but with a cold, intellectual pride. They were her masterpiece, her living proof that she had outsmarted fate itself. The children, in turn, were conditioned to feel a sense of superiority over the other enslaved people on the plantation, the ones she had inherited. This created a profound internal division. The legacy children who lived in the main house saw themselves as different, even as they remained in bondage. Their loyalty was not to their fathers or their mothers in the quarters, but to the mistress, who had created them, who had called them her legacy. As the 1850s wore on, the plan escalated. Catherine's journal entries became more chillingly precise, detailing the pairings of her children. The first generation of her experiment had reached adulthood. They were not to be sold. They were not to be freed. They were to be used as tools to create the next generation of workers. She would use the children of her children to create a workforce that was literally inseparable from her, from the land itself. By the early 1860s, Thornhill Estate was not a plantation anymore. It was a human factory. The main house was not a home, but a central office for Catherine's terrifying project. The horror was not in the lashing of a whip, but in the cold, dispassionate science of it all. The horror was in the chilling obedience of her children, their psychological chains far stronger than any lock. But the world outside was changing. Whispers of a war between the states grew into shouts. The sound of distant cannons would have been faint to the inhabitants of Thornhill Estate, but Catherine would have heard them, a harbinger of the end. And in the spring of 1864, the world, in the form of the 34th Massachusetts Infantry, was about to arrive at her doorstep, ready to put an end to her monstrous project. For 17 years, Catherine Thornhill had toiled in her own private world of depravity. The world of the Thornhill Estate was a closed loop, a human machine running with a chilling clockwork efficiency. But the grand machine of the American South was grinding to a halt, and Catherine's little world was about to be caught in the gears. In the spring of 1864, the Union Army was no longer a distant threat. It was a hungry, unstoppable force pushing deep into the heart of Georgia. The 34th Massachusetts Infantry, a regiment known for its grim resolve, was on a foraging mission. They were a small unit, moving fast and hard, disrupting Confederate supply lines and living off the land as they went. Their path was not a straight line, but a winding detour dictated by rumor and necessity. And a rumor is what led them to Thornhill Estate. A small group of freedmen and women were traveling with the Union patrol, their knowledge of the land a valuable currency. One among them, an elderly man named Samuel, had once worked on a neighboring farm. He had heard whispers from the enslaved people who lived at Thornhill. Strange, unsettling stories about the mistress and her special children. He spoke of children with a chilling family resemblance to their owner, a place where fear ran deeper than a whip slash. Samuel pointed them down a forgotten dirt road, a road that wasn't on their military maps. It led them directly to the decaying grandeur of Thornhill Estate. The soldiers, tired and weary, didn't expect to find much, just another abandoned plantation. But as they approached, a low, unnerving sound reached them, a sound they had not been prepared for. It wasn't the sound of an ambush. It was a rhythmic, frantic tapping, a muffled scratching coming from beneath the earth near the main house. Sergeant Silas Thorne, the same man who would later write the confidential Melita Rye letter, led his men to an old stone building. The source of the sound was a cellar door, a sheet of corroded iron, bolted shut by a massive rusty padlock. The air around the cellar was thick, stagnant, and cold. Thorne put his ear to the cold metal. He heard the muffled sound of children's voices, hushed and terrified. He heard a child sob, and then a whisper, a name being repeated over and over. Mistress. With a brutal swing of a rifle butt, the lock shattered. The sound was like a gunshot in the afternoon stillness. The iron door groaned open on its rusted hinges, revealing a gaping black maw. And as the foul air rushed out, thick with the smell of damp earth and something far more disturbing, the horror they had been marching toward for all these years was revealed. The soldiers raised their lanterns. In the flickering light, they saw the result of Catherine Thornhill's 17-year project. 23 children, huddled together in the darkness. The youngest, no more than 4, with eyes wide and blank. The oldest, a girl of 13, with a face that looked hauntingly like the woman in the faded portrait in the study. All of them bore the same distinctive features, the high cheekbones, the unnerving pale green eyes, the hair streaked with auburn and gold. They were her legacy. The soldiers had expected to find a place of typical wartime cruelty. They had expected to find a place of physical bondage. But what they had found was something new, something far more sinister. They had found an experiment. They had found human beings who had been bred and raised in a manner so cold, so clinical, that it defied all understanding. And as the children blinked at the sudden light, one of them whispered to a soldier, "Mistress says we are her legacy. We cannot leave. We are her blood." That was the moment the soldiers knew they had stumbled onto something far worse than a battle. They had found a silent, secret horror. They knew they had to find the woman who had created this nightmare. They had to find Catherine Thornhill. But the main house was empty. The mistress was gone. The nightmare was just beginning. Sergeant Silas Thorne and his men searched Thornhill Estate for 2 days. They were not looking for hidden Confederate troops. They were looking for a woman, for the mistress who had created this nightmare. But the house was a silent tomb. Every room was empty. Her clothing was gone, her jewelry box was empty, and the locked drawer of her writing desk had been picked clean. The cultivation records, the living record of her depravity, were nowhere to be found. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of a hurried flight. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist, leaving only the screaming, silent evidence of her crimes behind. But Catherine Thornhill had not vanished without a trace. Her disappearance left a void filled with rumor, speculation, and dread. The Union soldiers, in their official military records, noted only that the plantation mistress was absent from the property. But what happened to her became a ghost story whispered in the chaos of a dying Confederacy. The soldiers questioned the other enslaved people on the estate. The community was tight-lipped, their fear of the mistress still a cold, tangible thing. But with the Union Army on the property, and the promise of a freedom they had never known, some of them began to talk. And their stories were as varied as they were terrifying. An elderly house servant, a woman who had once attended to Richard, spoke in a hushed voice of a carriage. She had seen Catherine Thornhill packing trunks for weeks before the Union Army arrived. She said Catherine had a pre-planned escape, a route that led north toward Augusta. She knew the war was lost, the servant claimed, and she knew her time was up. She had vanished with her fortune, her records, and a promise that she would begin her dark work anew, somewhere far away from the smoking ruins of her past. In this version of the story, the monster got away, and was still out there, her legacy a festering wound in the world. But an older field hand, a man who knew the land better than any map, had a different theory. He spoke of the vast, untamed swamp that bordered the Thornhill property. He called it a hungry place, a dark heart that had seen too much misery. He said that in the final days before the soldiers arrived, he had seen Catherine Thornhill, alone, walking toward the swamp. He said she carried a small, sealed box. The man said the swamp took her. He claimed the land itself had finally had enough, and had swallowed the devil mistress whole, a kind of poetic and brutal justice for the souls she had tormented. In this version, Catherine Thornhill never escaped. She was a permanent, terrifying fixture of the land itself. But there was a third, and in some ways, the most chilling theory of all. The other enslaved people on the estate, the ones who had not been part of Catherine's legacy, told the soldiers that they had lived for years under the shadow of a human experiment, watching their master's twisted plan unfold. They had seen the terror in their children's eyes. They had watched a monster grow, unchallenged in their midst. In this version, the enslaved people themselves, pushed to their absolute limits, had finally found a way to take back their freedom. They had dealt with Catherine Thornhill themselves, and they had made sure that no one would ever find a trace of her. The truth of her demise was not found in the water of a swamp, but in a secret buried by those she had wronged. Sergeant Thorne and his men chose to believe the official report. The mistress was simply absent. They had a war to win. The 23 children were taken into custody and sent north, their ultimate fate lost to the chaos of the post-war years. Thornhill Estate is gone. The children it held are lost to time. The woman who ruled it vanished into the chaos of a dying nation. But the story of Catherine Thornhill lives on, a chilling whisper in the forgotten corners of American history. The true horror of this story is not just in the crimes she committed, but in the cold, methodical mind that conceived them. Catherine Thornhill was not a monster born of madness or rage. She was a monster born of pride and desperation. Her plan was a feat of cruel, rational engineering, a project she ran with the detached efficiency of an accountant. She treated human lives like numbers on a ledger, a calculation to solve a problem of debt. She created her own family in a way that ensured their eternal servitude. The fate of the 23 children, her living, breathing legacy, is a mystery that has no clean ending. We know they were taken north by the Union soldiers. But what became of them? Did they ever find a home? Did they ever truly find freedom? Or were they forever haunted by the psychological chains their mother had forged? Did they too one day look into a mirror and see the face of the monster who had created them? And what of the devil mistress herself? The questions remain, a ghost in the annals of Burke County. Did she escape? Did she truly vanish into the night, taking her depraved records with her, to begin her dark work anew? Is her lineage, the product of her vile experiment, still somewhere in the world, living among us, unaware of their horrifying origin? Or did she meet her fate at the hands of the land she tormented? Did the swamp finally claim her? Did the people she wronged finally silence her, erasing her from the world as she had tried to erase her own crimes from history? The secrets of Thornhill Estate were a truth too ugly for the history books, a reality too disturbing for polite society. But the story of Catherine Thornhill and her missing legacy serves as a haunting reminder. It tells us that some of the deepest wounds in history are the ones we try to forget. The scars of the past are not always found on the surface. Sometimes they are buried deep, in the silent places, waiting to be found. And when you look close enough, you will see that they are tied to a terrible truth, that some monsters are not born, but made.